5 seconds is all it takes. Well, that's what Schmidt says. She is basing her upcoming talk on science and data and a lot of testing, and I love all of those. So let's hear what she has to say about how important the first few seconds of your advertising materials really are, how to test what you do, and then really draw conclusions on that based on data that you collect. This will be insightful. Looking forward to your speech. The stage is yours, Millie.
Hello, Adworld, and welcome to this talk about design research and how a couple of hours of simple research can save you from failure, gather buy-in or decrease around your ambitious marketing gambits. I'm Millie. I am the Director of Product at Usability Hub. We are a product company. We build a tool that helps you test your design decisions with real people. Our customers are from all over the world, and we've actually been around for about 10 years, but we fly a little bit under the radar. Personally, I run the product team and the product strategy, and my background is in tech very firmly. I come from originally engineering background, then through UX design and now product. And I've worked in lots of startups and product companies for many years. And I really love lean product development, and I'm really good at helping teams move quickly and innovate through learning. So this talk today is all about mistakes. Mistakes are unavoidable, and it's about helping you accept that you too will make mistakes. And once you've accepted that, make a plan to be able to find them earlier. And then also make it safe to make mistakes and make your team comfortable with those mistakes, knowing that they will eventually be able to fix them. If you're not familiar with the idiom of the title, a stitch in time saves 9, the idea is that if you stitch a tear in a garment early, you'll stop that hole from expanding, which would require many more stitches in the future. So it alludes to the fact that many problems are much more efficient to fix early and get worse the longer that they are around for. So let's start with the story. You work as a marketing manager in a department store. One of your quarterly goals is to deliver a billboard campaign for new kitchen appliances. You quickly pull together a brief, contact the appliance manufacturer for some images, and send the brief away to your agency to book in media. Creative comes back with a few options to choose from, and you immediately circulate this to all your internal stakeholders, your line manager, maybe the brand representative, sales, customer service, and you ask everyone for feedback. You've got your favorite, and it's a unique appliance, and it's got a little cute pun, and it's all very nice. After you get your feedback back, one of your colleagues working on a different campaign looks over your shoulder and says, something that surprises you. They mentioned that the creative looks a little bit like a person. You shrug it off. It's just one opinion. No one else has mentioned it. Your agency designers get your brief. They create a really eye-catching design. You make sure your brand colors and fonts and logos and everything is correct. And one of the designers makes a bit of an offhand comment about not really being sure about what's being advertised, but it's not really their job to criticize the concept. So you take it to your agency to send the creative to media to publish. Your sales team needs this campaign out immediately so they can start selling. And your media agency needs the creative assets right now, or you'll miss out on the premium spot by the highway. There's a lot of pressure to get this out ASAP. So you hit the send button, lock everything in, and off you go. Next day, you're driving to work, and you catch a glimpse of a billboard on the side of the road, and you see that it's your ad. And as you drive by, you feel your stomach fall through the floor. You've accidentally printed a billboard that evokes the face of the most hated person in all of human history. So why does this happen? Why do oversights like this get shipped? Why do we see these funny blogs of like top 10 marketing fails? Why do projects sometimes go to prime time with mistakes baked in? Why didn't they get catched earlier? And why do teams ship creative that sometimes doesn't even hit the mark? There's a few reasons why. One of the big ones is that teams get lost in the assumptions. So in the story I told, both the colleague and the designer pointed out problems with the design, but the marketing manager ignored their feedback and didn't really think to test it at all. There are lots of reasons why we fail to test and therefore fail to discover these mistakes, including you run out of time, you might have like a highest paid person's opinion that you can't really contradict and it's political suicide to challenge in your organization, or maybe you just don't know how. You don't just not really sure exactly how you would go about validating or invalidating a hypothesis like that. The first step towards being able to test your assumptions is recognizing them. So as a designer, I know this, but it's something to reiterate that we're all making assumptions all the time. It's just how we work as humans. But some of the big ones that drove this campaign to this conclusion could have been the assumption that everyone is familiar with the concept of bells and whistles, that the pun will be recognizable in the short window while someone is driving past on the side of the road, that the placement of the ad on the billboards will be one where someone can look at it for a significant amount of time, that the kettle is a familiar object and won't cause any problems, or even that the brand is recognizable and that people will be able to quickly tell who is the advertiser and what are they advertising. Those are all assumptions. And once you can get to the stage that you can articulate them, you can also start thinking about how risky they are and whether you might need to test them. Another big reason why projects sometimes ship big mistakes is that you might be a victim of cognitive biases. Cognitive biases and other thinking errors are very tricky because they're technically subconscious. They're happening in the background. They're not necessarily something you're aware of. And this is where the behavioral psychology side of it comes in. So one of the most recognizable ways that this might manifest in your project is that you might feel like you're in the bubble with your design. For me, how this works is once I've been looking at something for too long, I stop being able to kind of see it. I need to see it with fresh eyes. And often when I show it to someone else, they might pick up something that I've completely missed. And this happens to teams all the time. Once they've been looking at something for way too long, they stop being able to see the forest for the trees. So there's three big biases at play in this example and probably many small ones. One of them would be the mere exposure effect, which is a psychological phenomenon by which people tend to develop a preference for things merely because they are familiar with them. So similar to the idea of being in the bubble, you tend to just like things that you have seen more of, which is very interesting. And it's another reason why when we test multiple different designs with people, we have to be aware that people are going to get attached to the one that they've already seen. A team might also be affected by a cognitive bias called the IKEA effect, where we place disproportionate value on a product that we have partially created. So this is about how the experiment that this came out of was asking people who have constructed pieces of IKEA furniture to put a value on them compared to ones that were already prefabbed, and they valued the ones that they constructed higher. So how this manifests in teams is that we tend to overly value the work that we have been a part of, and it becomes harder for us to think about it with a very dispassionate view. And the last one is an interesting one called escalation of commitment, which is a human behavior pattern in which an individual or group facing increasingly negative outcomes from a decision, action, or investment nevertheless continues the behavior instead of altering course. So it's essentially a loss avoidance behavior, but one that you see in many different ways, including gamblers who keep upping their bets even though they're losing. And finally, the big one here that we're probably all aware of is a compounding and amplifying effect, which is that the pressure to deliver makes it even less likely that you will take your time, that you'll check things thoroughly, and that you'll make sure that you're doing everything, in the best way possible. Not to say that you're going to do a terrible job, but obviously the closer you get to the end of the project, to the pointy end of that deadline, you're going to be speeding through and you're going to be way more interested in delivering it than necessarily trying to check every possible assumption, unless you've already built it into your process. So one of the best ways to mitigate this is to find low effort and low friction tools for your testing so that it doesn't seem like such a big ask. So how do we avoid a fascist kettle? First tip is to test early and often. In this example, the marketer could have tested many of those assumptions that we listed and saved themselves a lot of time, money, and reputational damage, both internally and externally with their customers. This is the first and most important lesson. Test early and often, much earlier than you think. Not after launch, not the day before launch. Test as early as at your concept stage for the absolute best results. The earlier you test, the more time you have to respond to the feedback and adjust course, which seems obvious when you say it, but you'd be surprised how late people put testing in their processes, and then they don't have enough time or sometimes budget to make any changes that comes out of the feedback that they've gathered. You also hit up against sunk cost fallacy and the pointy end of those deadlines. So you want to test often, you want to test at the concept stage, you want to test when it gets mocked up, you want to test when it's in production, various different levels of fidelity. And the reason why we suggest this is because at each of those different fidelity levels, new assumptions are kind of trickling into the project from different collaborators, from different constraints that you're hitting up against, from different decisions about your scope. So the more testing you do, the more you can catch those sneaky assumptions that continue to intrude on your project. And just a note about sunk cost fallacy, which is one of the biggest concepts we're working against here. Sunk cost fallacy, you probably know, is where people demonstrate a greater tendency to continue an endeavor once an investment in money, effort, or time has been made. So very similar to the escalation of commitment, and a very related concept. But the way that sunk cost fallacy works, and one of the big reasons why teams don't test or leave it too late or do too little of it, is this idea of avoiding changing something that you've already invested a lot into. In terms of design testing, how this manifests is often a resistance or fear of making changes to the creative in those latter stages of the project, as it's perceived by your team, and maybe rightly so, as rework and a waste of money. The key here, and it's hard, but the key is to remember that it's never too late to get that vital information. It's always, always, always going to be better to learn about a mistake before it happens rather than after, especially if it's a big campaign that is sending out to a lot of people. So the next thing to think about is that research just does not have to be an ordeal. Since COVID and 2020, the world of online research tooling has exploded. And researchers from all different walks of life, whether that's software, marketing, advertising, or other, are leveraging these tools that allow teams to not necessarily have to be in the same room with someone to do the research. The misconception about doing research is that it's time consuming, that you have to recruit hundreds of users, that you need hundreds and hundreds of people for statistical significance, that you need to compensate them all with like $50 or $100, that you might need to work with a recruitment agency, and that the process is going to take months. But that's actually just not the case about research anymore. Research can happen in as quickly as an hour or two if you use the right tools and you know what you're doing. Usability Hub, that company that I work at, is one of those tools that lets you run tests at a relatively low cost with a very broad reach in quite not a lot of time. We have a panel of 200,000 people across the world, and sometimes your tests come back in the time it takes to make a coffee, which is really not very long. But we're not even the only one. There are so many tools available. Some of them record someone giving you answers in this way with a video. Some of them will record them clicking on something on a screen. There are many different survey tools and many, many other ones that I don't have time to go into now. But I'm going to show you a preview of our tool as a little taster into this world. The next thing to remember is that first impressions really matter. And obviously from a web perspective, we have some studies specifically about how users' attention is apportioned when they are visiting websites online. So one study has even found that users can make an initial assessment in as little as 50 milliseconds, which is quicker than the blink of an eye. So someone jumps onto your website and within such a tiny period of time, they've already decided on their first impressions of that website. So I know that we're talking about websites, and earlier we looked at billboards, but you can see how the same kind of thinking could definitely apply to something like a billboard where you're only driving past it for a second, or a piece of packaging that you walk past in a minute, or any of the other kind of advertising formats which tend to not have captive audiences. Scientists, when they were constructing this specific study about websites, if you don't believe me, analyzed page visit durations for more than 205,000 different web pages, and each of those pages had more than 10,000 visits. So this data is aggregated from 2 billion events or individual users visiting websites. And the results of this study were that the first 10 seconds of the page visit are also critical for users' decisions to stay or leave. So you've got those kind of 50 milliseconds of your first gut feeling, and then you really only have 10 seconds in terms of the rest of those decisions. So to get those users and to capture them within those first minutes, you really have to communicate your value proposition within 10 seconds. So in those first few seconds, users are not looking at something like a designer, like I would or you would. They're not looking at it carefully and poring over it and reading it multiple times. They're actually engaging a totally different part of their brain, which is the limbic system, or you might know as the lizard brain or the fight or flight part of the brain, rather than their prefrontal cortex, which does complex reasoning and decision making, and is what we might look at if we were kind of reviewing something. Another framing is Daniel Kahneman's fast and slow thinking. And the easiest way to describe it is that fast brain is your kind of instinctive brain, and your slow brain is your considering brain. And you really have to make sure that your designs are made for the fast brain, and then potentially, if you are able to capture more attention, be able to also make designs that service the slow brain. So the very good news in this case, even with all of this quite confronting data about how little attention people will give a lot of your designs, is that there are some amazing tools out there that help you test exactly this. So I'm going to show you an extremely simple test that I created that could have saved this team quite a lot of pain. The test really only took about an hour to create, and I'm aware that I'm an expert, but as you'll see, the test is very simple. So I'm going to show you, I'll give you a bit of a preview of what this test looks like. So this is what it looks like when you're taking the test. Very simple screen. I'm going to ask this user to view the image for 5 seconds. You'll be familiar with it at this point. And then answer a simple question. What is this ad about? I think it's about teapots. Did I notice anything unusual about the image? Yes? A bell? Was there a face? And then I want to double check, have they seen this billboard before? Yes or no, very simple. Just because this campaign was from quite a while ago, I just wanted to add this to my data set. I actually hadn't seen it before. And then I'm giving them a time to engage that slow thinking. So now that you have a bit more time to examine the image, how would you describe it? It does look a bit like a famous dictator. And that's it. That's the whole test. So that test, as I said, only took about an hour to create. And this is what it looks like when you're actually going to send out the test. So I sent this out to the broadest possible audience. It cost me 150 credits, which is $150 on our platform. Still maybe a lot compared to nothing, but compared to a big research project, it's very cheap. And the turnaround time was 5 minutes. So you get the results very, very fast. Now, I haven't shown you the whole results page here, but I have selected some of the results that came in. And as you'll notice, the questions that I asked did not lead users in any particular direction. But I would suggest that if you have even one comment in your design feedback that your design reminds even one person of Hitler, you probably need to revise your design. And I would suspect if even one comment came through like this for that team, they probably would have rethought it. So for anyone who is particularly dubious about my research methodology, this is the question that KPCC's readers were asked about that same ad, where they asked, does this JC Penney billboard in Culver City look like Hitler? And even in that leading question, 31% of people said yes. But let's just recognize that if someone hadn't seen it after reading this question, they definitely would. So in the way that I asked the questions, which was a lot more open, I didn't suggest this thing to users at all. I asked, what is the ad about? Did you notice anything unusual? And now you've had any extra time to examine the image, would you describe it differently? And these are questions that you can reuse on any campaign, really. What is this about? Is there anything confusing or unusual? Now that you've had a bit more time, is there anything else you'd like to add? And this also accounts for the fact that maybe the team themselves didn't actually see it. So this kind of generalized testing methodology is both simple, but very, very, very powerful. And if the team hadn't seen that fascist teapot themselves and ran this test, they may have been surprised by the comments that came through. And they could have discovered this error through research before they printed on many billboards around the country. So what did we learn? And how can you take this back to your own projects? First thing is, beware of the bubble. So remember that as you go about your projects, you and everyone involved is adding their own assumptions in as you go along. You also lose the ability to see which of your assumptions are risky and not when you spend a lot of time in that bubble on the project. Try to remember, if you can, to identify those assumptions and question them as you go. You don't have to be a sophisticated scientist to do research. Research is complex, I'll give you that, but you can avoid catastrophic project failure without being a scientist or a research specialist. Lucky for us all, so many tools exist now that can help you test those assumptions easily, cheaply, and quickly. Tools like Usability Hub and many more. You can even make research fun. Ideally, your team should want to do it. To get this feedback gives you this instant kind of dopamine hit of being already either hitting the mark with someone or getting the feedback that you need to refine your message. It takes less than an hour to set up a quick test, and you should get the results back in the same day, if not faster. Testing these assumptions helps you decrease your project risk. This is my mantra. You can use it to avoid mistakes like this, but think as well about how you can use this to be ambitious, that you can use this to maybe get a little bit of buy-in from your team about an idea that's a little bit more out there. You might be building confidence, you might be gaining insight, and you might just be getting a little bit of outsider authority to make sure that your idea doesn't sound quite so crazy. Real world feedback is the best. It's so good, it's so energizing, and now that it's so easy, it seems silly not to do it. That's all from me. Thanks very much. I hope that you really enjoy the process of doing research and that you give it a go. There's really not a lot to lose, and the more that you do it, the more that you're going to enjoy it, and hopefully bring your team along for the journey. Thanks.